Hello and welcome to this CommonSpace snap reaction video. Boris Johnson has been elected Tory leader and therefore is going to become Prime Minister. He won by 66% of the vote, 2/3 of the vote, defeating Jeremy Hunt. In his victory speech he said that people will be questioning what they've done, but that Tory instincts have always been right throughout history. And that he was going to unite the country to defeat Jeremy Corbyn and energise the country. I'm joined by David Jamieson, CommonSpace journalist, and we're just going to talk about what he said and about what Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister and what we should expect in the coming weeks. David, what did you think?
I didn't think it was a very impressive speech.
Mm-hmm.
He can, at his best, be quite good at kind of rhetoric and stuff like that, and outlining a kind of new vision for the country. I actually thought it was a big departure from the speech he made a couple of years ago at Conservative Conference, where, in contrast to Theresa May, he spoke about what sounded like quite a hard right kind of speech,
Mm-hmm.
to reorganise society on quite different political lines. Straight from the off, it feels to me like Boris Johnson, what his advisors are telling him is, you have a very small majority in the Parliament. There's a good deal of hostility against you, not just among sections of the population, but among sections of the elite as well,
Mm-hmm.
not just in the press, but in things like the civil service, which had a recent falling out with, and you need to come across with a kind of conciliatory note. That's what I kind of took away from that. To me, that just suggests that he's entering into many of the same problems that Theresa May had to come up against.
So Theresa May will be officially resigning tomorrow. She'll do her last Prime Minister's questions tomorrow, and then Boris Johnson will be unveiled tomorrow evening. Should we read anything into what he said during the campaign, his campaign for leadership, in terms of what he's going to do? So he said, do or die, come what may, we'll be leaving on the 31st of October, even if that means a no-deal Brexit. Do those words mean much now that he's going to be in power and his faces have an extremely weak position in terms of a majority, wafer-thin majority? He might not even have a majority on Brexit. What should we expect now?
I don't think that meant much. I think that what Boris Johnson was doing was signalling to the Tory party membership that he was Mr. Brexit. I think that, and you need a very clear-cut message to get that through to a party membership which is very pro-Brexit and is probably by this point very cynical.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect it was also partly about sending a message to the European bureaucracy that he wanted a serious renegotiation. I think people might panic once, I think over the next few days, he will staff out his new government with mainly Brexiteers.
Mm-hmm.
But to be honest, it would be very difficult for that not to be the case at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, because he saw how unstable May's government became, because it was more or less, it was mainly pro-Remain, but it was quite evenly split between the two factions. But also because, of course, lots of senior Remainers in the Tory party have basically said that they will not be involved in his government. So I think people might be in danger of seeing that as a move towards a very hard Brexit strategy. But also remember, during his campaign, he spent a lot of his time talking about things like tax cuts for the richest, and trying to play down this idea that, he had famously said fuck business at some point. But as he kept saying, he was the most pro-banker, leading Conservative at the time of the financial crisis. So, as I say, I suspect that his strategy is not as populist or ruptural as he might have wanted to make it sound at the start of the leadership campaign, or as I say, a couple of years ago.
So the way through Brexit, I mean, there's three options really that I can see that he could pursue, presuming that he doesn't go to negotiate a new deal and gets everything he wants. Obviously, that's not.
Mm-hmm.
We know that's not going to happen. The first is a no deal, but it's quite difficult to deliver a no deal. There's a parliament. The parliament is clearly. There was a vote last week which showed a majority of 41 for opposed to proroguing Parliament. Parliament's clearly opposed to no deal happening.
Yeah.
So delivering no deal might be difficult, even if he wanted to do it. The second thing is a deal, basically, which is basically based on May's deal, basically keeps the withdrawal agreement in place, but maybe tweaks the wording, tweaks the language, and with the hope that a kind of Brexit veneer, of an all Brexit cabinet and Boris Johnson being someone who voted leave, is able to garner enough support in the Parliament to get it through. It's difficult still to see where the votes come from. You don't get rid of the backstop, you're not going to get the DUP on board. So it's difficult to see still where a majority comes from for that. And also that leaves the danger open of the Brexit party, Kyle Phil betrayal, and Boris being squeezed between a pincer between the Brexit party on the one side and the Lib Dems and Labour on the other side in a future election. And the other option I can see is a general election, where he basically uses a kind of bounce that most Prime Ministers get when they first come into office. Let's see if he gets it, but even Gordon Brown got it, even Theresa May got it. Yeah. A bounce when they first come in to have an election before the question of Brexit becomes, before he's confronted fully with the question of Brexit. So he's able to play on his rhetoric and ride his rhetoric into a general election maybe in September. Where do you see it going over the next couple of months?
I think it's very hard to make a prediction on that. I from what I've seen so far, as I say, from Boris Johnson's from the last few days, it seems to me he's going to try and go for another deal. I think that would be the automatic stance of someone in his position. It would be a very bold move to go for a general election. Who knows? That could depend on how much of a bounce he gets over the next few weeks and how long it lasts. But then when the EU reject that, when the EU basically say we're reject a new deal, then what? This is the thing. I don't think people should be looking at this situation as a dangerous new political force has entered the fray. I think people are in danger of sort of turning Boris Johnson into a new Trump, and he's not that. He's someone who's entering, who's become Prime Minister. Bear in mind, this is someone who's wanted to be Prime Minister all of his life, and the circumstances under which he's finally got it is he has a majority of 3. Most of his own parliamentarians don't agree with him on a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit. He has the rogue option of a general election, which could break the deadlock feasibly, but is just fraught with incredible dangers, and the Tory party is still so scarred from its experience in 2017. So I don't think he has a lot of good options.
Still has all the same constraints.
Still has all the same problems that Theresa May has. And I was listening to something that Peter Oborne said about this recently when he said, the predictions game is largely over except for one fact, which is that the next few months will be the most explosive in British political history that anyone, he said, in his lifetime, and I think he's in his 60s, has ever seen. So there's going to be an almighty confrontation over the question of a hard or a no-deal Brexit, for example. The civil service, the business press, or organisations like the CBI have already begun a campaign saying that no-deal Brexit is totally unacceptable, and they have the majority of the House of Commons on site in that campaign. And then you also have to ask yourself about the psychology of Boris Johnson. Is he someone who would be willing to launch Britain? We say these next coming months will be the greatest crisis. If there actually were a no-deal Brexit at the end of that process, Britain would enter an utterly unprecedented state of political crisis. Is Boris Johnson the kind of personality who thinks that's acceptable? Again, you get a lot of people who say yes, because he's just this crazy clown figure. He isn't. I think what he's exposed himself as since the beginning of the Brexit crisis is someone who's actually quite weak, someone who's quite indecisive, someone who lacks the courage of his own convictions, someone who doesn't have a lot of convictions, let's be honest, but someone who's driven largely by personal ambition. Would he be willing to completely destroy that ambition by taking either the option of a general election or the option of a no-deal Brexit? Or is he going to try and muddle through again? I suspect that the middle option is the one that he will try for now.
And it probably won't be clear what he's willing to do, what forces he's willing to confront until quite deep into this process.
Except, of course, with the general election, I think he probably has to make a decision on that soon. Because as the Brexit deadline approaches, various different political forces will get the measure of. So, for example, if the Brexit deadline is approaching and it looks clear that he'll do anything to compromise and try and get a May-style deal through, albeit with a couple of changes or whatever, he's already destroying a fragile coalition.
Let's talk briefly about Scotland and Boris Johnson's impact on Scottish politics. There's been a lot of hopes in the independence movement that Boris is the ticket to independence, that because he's been he's said a lot of anti-Scottish things in the past that are on record. He's not a character that's liked in Scotland. Partly that's about his demeanour. He's really posh and whatnot. How do you see that? How do you see a Boris Johnson premiership playing out in terms of Scotland?
I mean, not well. Again, this reminds me of. There's a certain sense in which he's. A couple of years ago, like I keep saying about that speech he made at the Conservative conference, he put forward a very polarising message about how he was going to do politics. And he's the sort of figure for whom polarisation would work. But the binds that are on him now in the ruling elite are such that I think he'll find that extremely difficult to pull off. So he could have put himself in a position where it didn't matter to him that people in places like Scotland, he was largely reviled, so long as he held on to a certain right-wing sentiment in other parts of the country. I don't think he's in that position, so I think it will actually hurt someone like Boris Johnson that he's disregarded by large parts of the UK, including Scotland. As for would it, for example, make Scottish independence more likely? At this stage, that depends entirely on the willingness of pro-independence forces to pursue independence.
Yes.
You can imagine a situation where if a really serious, the demand for an independence referendum was put to Boris Johnson's door, and he said no, the kind of unity you could create around that demand, but only if you're willing to go for it. I mean, yes. I think that the subjective factor that matters in terms of Scottish independence that at this point is the independence movement. It's not really who's in Downing Street.
Because there's the Prime Minister, whether it's Theresa May or it's Boris Johnson, always can resort to just saying no.
Yes, and at that point you have to decide what you're going to do.
How you're willing to confront that issue.
If you were willing to go down someone like George Kerevan's road, George Kerevan's always said you need to turn independence into a mass movement now, not just during a
block for London Metro.
That's one idea he put forward, but what he's talking about is a social movement that deploys multiple tactics to build support in its own base and to put pressure on the kind of central state mechanism. If you're unwilling to adopt a strategy of that kind, then the word no from a Theresa May or a Boris Johnson is all it takes. If you're completely committed to a process for the independence movement which absolutely depends on permission from the person in Downing Street.
Final thing, you said that Boris Johnson isn't Donald Trump, but clearly part of his support base is because he's willing to deploy certain tactics that are kind of a bit like Donald Trump, like calling Muslim women, comparing Muslim women to letterboxes. He draws in a kind of celebrity populist kind of thing, the same thing. What does Boris Johnson being Prime Minister tell us about where politics is at generally?
It's hard to say because he wasn't elected.
Sure.
I mean, so that's not. We haven't taken the temperature of the country here. We've taken the temperature of
Conservative members.
A group of. I mean, I think did they say there were 150,000 people eligible to vote in the election. So that's who we've taken the temperature of, and certainly there are quite a lot of right-wing cranks in that pool. So. I don't know that it takes the temperature of the country. But the thing about Boris Johnson is, I mean, Donald Trump was a racist when he was campaigning. He was a racist when he was just a TV celebrity, and now that he's president, he's still a racist. Like this is the thing that he is carried on in the United States, and to an extent, it's institutionally easier for Trump to behave that way because of the kind of independence that the president has from other offices of state. A prime minister's not like that. So Boris Johnson has been a racist his entire media and political career. Once he becomes Prime Minister, can he behave in the same way? As I say, that speech to me and his behaviour towards the end of this campaign, when it became clear he would win, is that he's going to have to accept enormous institutional pressures from the wider elite around him. That doesn't mean, of course, that he can't engage in demagoguery. I mean, Theresa May was the architect of the go home bans.
Sure.
You know, you can engage in demagoguery there, and it'd be interesting to see if he tries to.
But you're seeing this more as continuity with Toryism rather than a kind of new rupture with what Toryism's been in the recent past.
I think Boris Johnson seems to me to be pointing in towards that direction of sort of continuity. And, you know, personality isn't everything in these circumstances. But people like Trump or Salvini, right, who in politics today, or Viktor Orban, they are completely belligerent actors, and they approach every issue with a mallet, you know what I mean, and try to ram home their own political aesthetic. Boris Johnson to me is a weak individual. And I think if his advisors continually lean on him and say, you're not putting that kind of rhetoric out there, we're not going to adopt this or that chaotic strategy, I think they can put him in line. And there's a huge amount of pressure. It's not, I mean, I've talked so far about the civil service and the media and the CBI and his own party colleagues. You know, on the other side, there's a huge amount of influence, pressure on him from forces like the ERG, who can remind him at every step just what the Brexit party did to them in the last European election. So, to me, far from this kind of strutting man of history, Boris Johnson at the moment is a bit like a caged animal. And the question for him is, how does he negotiate his way around all of these forces? But for people who are opponents of Boris Johnson, the question for them is, how do they use that position of weakness to attack him? And the one thing that Boris Johnson has going for him in this period is a strange mood of political quietism has descended on the country. And most forces which see themselves in opposition are largely restraining themselves to sort of commentary about events as they're going on, usually to saying the same thing over and over again, which is, look at it, isn't it crazy, and all this kind of stuff, as though those words will somehow bring people back to their senses. Over the next few months, as I say, there will be massive political crisis, and Boris Johnson will survive until someone kicks him out of the way, basically.
So Common Space is going to be covering that political crisis over the next 3 months, heading up to October 31st. You can read about it all on CommonSpace.Scot. You can listen to our podcast, and we'll have more videos on it. So check out CommonSpace.Scot, the Twitter and the Facebook, and get involved in the discussion.